Hello and welcome to Critical Eye, a show in which we go deeper. We look inside the stories which others neglect and perhaps also skirt over. Today's topic is very simple, it's straightforward. It's the dear old British government going back to the traditional issue of violating people's civil liberties. We've got a notion now which involves bringing in organisations like Greenpeace, perhaps even Campaign Against Arms, and many others that have been listed that could potentially be regarded as a terror threat. Really, is it this point that we've now reached where we're actually now picking out those activists on the ground that might be battling for the rights of ordinary folk or for morally upright causes? Are we now actually witch hunting these kind of organizations as well? The Muslims will say we've been there for several years. Now, obviously, it seems to be the turn of other justice activists. With me in the studio, I have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you very much for having me back on.
Director of Politics First.
Politics First.
Thorn in the side of most of parliamentarians. That's the way we'd like you to be, hopefully. And we've also got Imran Shah. Welcome, Imran.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Still an advocate for MPAC,
yes,
campaign group, which is well known for its activities in trying to bring various organisations, if you like, under the spotlight when they're acting in a naughty manner. Are our civil liberties worth defending? It seems that increasingly the British society is ceding ground. This notion of terror, the idea of securitization, the need for greater security is what the government uses quite often to sell more and more restrictions on the civil liberties of ordinary folk. Marcus, how do you see the latest, if you like, noises coming from Westminster, especially this idea of starting to highlight organisations which are pretty benign to my kind of knowledge, certainly?
Well, Britain is becoming an increasingly intolerant and dangerous country for those who hold and voice opinions which threaten the interests of the British state and the British establishment. And remember, the British state and the British establishment are not Britain. They are very different things. Now, why is Britain becoming more and more intolerant of other opinions? Well, quite simply because there is more information available to ordinary men and women in the United Kingdom today. And that on its own constitutes a threat to the British official narrative about, for example, the political system in Britain, the economic system in Britain, and of course, British foreign policy. So that is why we are now seeing a clampdown by the British authorities. So the groups which have now been targeted consist of left-wing groups, anti-war groups, environmental groups, and also animal rights groups. Now, the left-wing groups are being portrayed as extremist and potentially terrorist groups. Why? Because they challenge the political and economic system of Britain. Anti-war groups are exposing the reality of Britain's wars around the world and also the impact of Britain's participation in the arms trade. If we take animal rights groups are promoting veganism because animal rights groups believe that all life is sacred. So why are they being targeted? Because the meat, dairy and egg industry in the United Kingdom is absolutely enormous. So we have different groups which are campaigning for different causes being denigrated, being discredited and being demeaned. Why? Because they pose a serious threat to the British state and to the British establishment. So they have to have their credibility, their integrity and their reputation destroyed.
Thank you, Marcus. Imran, you're no stranger to this scenario. MPAC itself has been the target of various allegations by right-wing media, mainstream broadsheet media quite often in the past. What do you make of this? And you might be able to give us a little bit of background on the experiences of Muslim organisations or justice activism organisations over the past 20 years since 9/11 or 7/7. How do you frame these new rules in the context of what you guys have been experiencing?
Well, I mean, the prevent agenda, which is the heart of the counter-extremism policy, since Cameron has been entirely, completely and utterly geared toward trying to clamp down dissent. You know, Muslim organisations like ourselves and others have been clear about saying that. And so when it comes to the what you hear now, this is really just an extension of what was happening before. So for us as Muslims, we were the soft target. We were essentially the boogeyman, and this was essentially done to us because we didn't have the capacity to fight back, and we didn't have the capacity to essentially call it out as it was. And also on top of that, it was easy for us to be labelled as conspiracy theorists by not only the establishment media but also by mainstream masjids, by mainstream sort of Muslim political voices. And so as a consequence, we were essentially the best target in order to make this policy normalised and to get its pass in Parliament and to make it the laws that it needed to be across the board. So really what we have is an extension of that, and like really what needs to be first acknowledged is that we got it right all along. Like, this was a policy that was geared towards clapping down dissent. It was geared towards shrinking the space of democracy and civil society, of accountability and transparency. And now that essentially Muslims have known their place, you've got imams causing up to prevent and other sort of policies. Now you have that being broadened towards left-wing, environmental, and also the likes of the SNP and Plaid Cymru. So this is essentially the British state using policy and using basically a soft sort of spy sort of network through NHS and through other public servants to essentially create a culture of we need to deal with these extremists. These are people that are a threat to the state, and it's using the apparatus of the state in order to do so. So this is really just as we've constantly underlined, this is nothing but demonization, and ultimately it's a threat to our democracy, it's a threat to our civil society and everything that we view to protect our civil liberties and our freedom and our ability to dissent.
Coming back to Marcus on this, Marcus, what Imran said is really almost as if there is a kind of an engineering program, some sort of a specific policy. Is that how you see it? Do you see that there's been a very step-by-step procedure that we're going through? And if so, where are we going next?
Well, I would say it's a unwritten policy, and I would argue that this is nothing new. It didn't start 20 years ago. It didn't start 30 years ago. It is an unofficial policy which has been implemented, which has been practiced in Britain for centuries. And it is no surprise, therefore, that relatively speaking, and certainly in comparison to other nations around the world, the British people are not a politically aware, they're not a politically informed, they're not a politically enlightened people, far different to how, for example, the French people are, or the German people are. Now, it is very clear that on the back of that, by labelling certain organisations, movements, and indeed causes in the United Kingdom as extremist and potential terrorist, that will be received by ordinary British people in quite a receptive way. And therein lies the problem. That is how the British state has avoided serious, radical change for centuries. Indeed, the country has never really experienced a revolution, certainly not a revolution on the scale that occurred in France or occurred in Russia. So that is a challenge. Yes, democracy is being threatened today. Yes, there is more and more pressure on individuals, on groups, people indeed in the public eye who are challenging the British official narrative. But this is not a new phenomenon. That is how Britain works in practice. When we hear British politicians and British journalists purport that Britain is a free country, is a democratic country, that is not exactly telling the truth. Britain is free, Britain is democratic, but only relatively speaking. So I can go on television today or tomorrow and I can call British foreign policy criminal. But then what happens to me the day after or a week after? All of a sudden, the Times newspaper or the Telegraph or the Sun write very disparaging articles about me, calling me a Russian propagandist or an Iranian propagandist or someone that is a stooge of the Kremlin. So that is the reality about Britain in practice. And yes, this list of extremist groups, it is very, very disconcerting, but this is not new. This is the way Britain has been functioning for centuries. It's just that we're becoming more aware of it. Why are we becoming more aware of it? Because of social media, because of the internet, and because of alternative television channels and news channels such as Ahlebait TV, which we should be ever so thankful for that we have television channels such as Ahlebait TV, because I well remember the 1990s when the West broke up Yugoslavia, and that was the staging ground for countries afterwards such as Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria, etc. But when there were those of us who protested against the West's breakup of Yugoslavia, we didn't have Ahlebait TV, we didn't have press TV, we didn't have social media. All we could do was go to Trafalgar Square and protest. Now, in 2020, the British establishment is still dominant in the field of information, of communication, telling British people what they wanted to hear. But they don't have the field to themselves as they once did in the 1990s. So the fact that environmental groups, the fact that left-wing groups, the fact that animal rights groups have been included on this list of extremist groups shows that the British establishment, yes, they're still entrenched in power, but they are feeling threatened somewhat, and this is a response to the threat that they are feeling.
Okay. Imran, let's move on to solutions. Of course, we're talking about a policy which is quite insidious on the surface of it. Basically, if government is going around steadily working for corporate power or whoever else in order to cut down our civil liberties, what is it that we should be doing? What is the public should be doing? What is it that, say, activist organizations can do to push back against this violation of our rights?
Well, the core thing is that what they're trying to do is to make citizens into subjects, and this is kind of, again, an echo of the past. This is the way in which the British establishment over the centuries have essentially are used to having their society built upon. So what's happening now is that over the civil society organizations, the human rights organizations, campaign activist organizations that have flourished over the last 30 years or so, they're now being faced with the idea that they are unwelcome inside the space of Britain, and are seen as a threat to the British establishment. So what's happening here is that they're trying to reduce the role of the citizen into essentially just an economic slave, and we kind of have to resist that by saying that actually no, we're not suspects, we're not subjects, we are citizens, we have our rights, these are our freedoms, and we will fight for them. And that's essentially something that we need to join together across religious boundaries, across ideological boundaries, and across political boundaries. These are a fundamental thing. So, you know, what classically, what Windrush, the Windrush scandal classically has shown us is that they don't have any concern of the idea of citizenship. There's no sacredness to it, and so if you are the wrong type of citizen, or if they're going to use you as a soft target, they can get rid of your citizenship, and it doesn't matter. And this is again another infringement on fundamental basic rights. Of not just civil but human rights, which the state is violating. And yes, they've apologized for it before, but it's still happening right now. And so what you have now is a complete and utter, especially from David Cameron onwards, a complete and utter disregard for accountability, and to answer any questions that essentially inform the public, and just simply deny and roll out the program. That's exactly what they've done with Prevent. That's exactly what they've done with Windrush, and they'll do this again with the whole counter-extremism apparatus. We need to resist that, even if it means civil disobedience, even if it means legal means, even if it means essentially just constantly calling out and trying to shape public opinion to do those two things: legal opposition as well as civil disobedience.
I noticed on some headlines across the broadsheets this week that I think the police are actually now confirming that facial recognition across London is pretty much going to be de facto. That's quite frightening as well, and it's kind of an extension to what we're talking about in terms of civil liberties. Of course, you can justify these kind of actions very easily once you have a securitized state or a mindset within the people which is scared of terrorism, scared of violence, scared of burglaries, etc., etc. The police obviously get sanctions to start basically scanning people's faces and say we're actually only looking for criminals. But what kind of safeguards are there for ordinary folk not to be brought into the net? Now that actually this net seems to be getting wider and wider, do you find this use of modern technology is an addition or to the bow of the police and security services string, which is to the detriment of our civil liberties as well?
Most certainly. You're going to see some very strange and very wild and crazy policies from this particular government. Not just because it's led by Boris Johnson, but also because essentially what Theresa May and David Cameron couldn't do under their small majorities, they're going to try and push harder now under their big majority. So this isn't just a Boris Johnson thing, this is really a Tory party thing. And they've been laying the ground for this for a long time. The hostile environment that was created by Theresa May when she was the Home Secretary was extended when she was Prime Minister, and this is now just an extension of that. So there is history for this, at least in recent history. And so the idea of being tough on crime really sort of plays well towards essentially right-wing minded Tory voters, the majority base, but it also makes a means in which people can be rushed. There's a culture of fear, and there's a sense of hopelessness and disempowerment. Now, for me, in my mind, there's two main antidotes, at least means of resistance. One is that locally there has to be alliance building, whether it's with mosques, churches, community organizations, anti-racist organizations, and so on. There has to be that alliance building in that local community who can stand together. And secondly is that there has to be a means of constantly dissenting and highlighting these crimes and setting the narrative on these, because obviously they will try and justify it in their own way. They'll say because of knife crime or other things, when we know that really when it comes to those issues there's much more pragmatic, there's already been set examples of how to solve those issues. And so we should be constantly calling it out, constantly dissenting, and constantly alliance building with those, with each other, at least on a local level, in order to defend ourselves against the top-down policies that are going to come through.
what will be the consequence of not doing such a thing, Imran?
Well, this will be normalised. You've found that with when it comes to prevent, it is essentially the Muslims, imams, the other Muslims that had thought this was a good idea, that essentially normalises at such a level it's now being used as an attack on democracy. So it will become the new norm, and that shouldn't be that shouldn't be like a strange or bizarre thing to say. The way in which the freedoms and the civil liberties in which we kind of take for granted can be eroded away, and they are being eroded away. And so the norm is constantly shifting, and what you may have is that really our ability to fight back and our ability to stand up against that will become much more smaller, much more weaker, and at some point the activism space and the space for civil society will be close to collapse. And once you have that, you don't have a democracy except by name.
Okay, Marcus, some real dangerous soothsaying there, some threatening stuff potentially if we don't get our act together. I've also noticed that Facebook and Twitter and such, if you like, agencies, after last year's big push, I think, by governments to tell them to step into line, seem to have fallen into line, because just recently, on one incident alone, which I've monitored, the assassination of Lieutenant General Soleimani, saw thousands and thousands of accounts being shut down, suspended, simply because people put up a poster in support of a man who was killed by American forces in Iraq, extrajudicially, I might add, and yet people were being penalized on social media, the major ones, Twitter, Google, Facebook, all of them were at it, shutting people down, threatening them effectively. And that is the bigger global, if you like, context, which I'd like to conclude things with you on, that civil liberties on a national level is one thing, but on an international level, it seems that this is feeding in, because the American government, for instance, could influence these transnational corporations to do what they tell them, which is, again, a massive violation of people's liberty, more fear, more demoralization.
Yes, but I think we need to live in the world of realpolitik. No one should be surprised by hostile actions from companies such as Facebook, Twitter, or Google. And it's certainly the case, and I would submit this, that anyone who is angry about hostile action from companies such as Facebook or Twitter to silence criticism of the American government or the British government, I don't know why they're angry. Now, let me explain that. Those companies play an everyday role in the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. So therefore, it is simply inconceivable that a company such as Facebook is not going to have close ties to the American government, to the American elite, to the American establishment. Therefore, because of that unofficial relationship, it is inevitable that Facebook is going to close down the account of a prominent person who is challenging the narrative, the American narrative on General Soleimani, and or Twitter doing something very similar. We need to remember something very, very simple. And to put it in a colloquial way, we are on their turf when we post on Facebook, when we tweet on Twitter, or when we use Google accounts, Gmail accounts, for example, because that is the terrain of the West. That is why I yearn for the day when a massive competitor to Facebook, to Twitter, or to Google will emerge in countries such as Russia or Iran, companies, platforms that would be truly able to provide fierce competition to companies such as Facebook and Twitter. Until that day comes, we will remain on their turf and we will be at their mercy. So we should not be surprised or angry by hostile moves from Twitter or Facebook. At the end of the day, those aforementioned companies have close ties to the American government. If they did not allow themselves to have close ties to the American government, then the American government would not allow them to have such a prominent role in the everyday lives of Americans, or indeed people across the world. That is the brutal reality, and we have to remember that. We must live in the world of realpolitik.
Well, some sage advice and some reality checks, really. What do we do about it? Well, bottom line is it's ultimately our choice. We can opt out of many of these things. We can certainly rely on alternative media as it emerges, but I think that we cannot expect the wolf to effectively let the lamb live in peace. So I am afraid that it does seem like all too often the political and economic powers that be behave like wolves, and it does rather seem like we're the lambs. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Critical Eye. Until the next week, goodbye.